All right, looks like you should probably see that. So one, thank you for the invite to speak with you today. And what I've done is Kathy gave me a little background on, in addition to what she gave up top, about what your group or action team is after. So just a little background on myself first. I'm the Wisconsin Wetlands Association local government outreach specialist. So I provide technical assistance to counties, municipalities, and tribes across the state, and also respond to a lot of the questions or concerns we get from concerned citizens or others looking to better manage and care for wetlands on their property. My background is I'm a planner by trade. I came out of the Urban and Regional Planning program out of UW-Madison. I worked a couple of years at DNR on policy issues, and then I've been at the Wisconsin Wetlands Association for about 11 years now. So I've combined a couple presentations. If it appears clunky at all, it's just the way it's stitched together, but I'm going to try to cover a couple different topics. If there are any questions along the way, please don't hesitate to stop me. So we'll be touching on how communities can utilize wetlands to solve problems. So our organization, if you're not familiar, we're a statewide science-based organization. We really strive to get outside of that Madison-Milwaukee corridor and engage in place-based work to help communities solve problems by managing wetlands within their communities and upstream of their communities to deal with flooding, water quality, groundwater depletion, habitat, open space, quality of life. There's a number of different issues. And the concepts are always the same. It's just that you may tailor them based on the problem you're trying to address. So our model, we really strive to be nonpartisan and operate at a watershed scale. That means in a lot of ways when we engage in a community, the first step is convening the community leaders and other experts to understand what actually is happening and what are the underlying drivers. Coming up with ways to diagnose the problem and thinking about solutions and who to connect with and other experts in the region to help design technical assistance and other projects and actions that get at those underlying drivers. And then helping communities to mobilize and rally around certain issues. You see our website and our Twitter handle if you're and want to find more info there. As I said, with solving problems, it's really over the last couple of years we've really shifted to promoting the idea of hydrologic assessment, restoration, and management. So you need to restore and preserve our hydrologic conditions if you're going to build the resilience needed to deal with water quality and other hazards within your community. With that means understanding the context of your particular landscape. What's the historic connections? What did the landscape look like? Is there an ability to bring back those conditions within a modern context and within existing infrastructure constraints? What are the needed the hydrologic processes and functions, and how do you balance those? And really it's striving, and what you'll see at a lot of my presentation will focus on the idea of you need to deal with the water movement through our communities and reconnecting channel, floodplain, and wetland systems. So just a couple concepts real quick about healthy watersheds. It all starts in the headwaters. If our headwaters are dysfunctional and you have damaged hydrology, you're going to experience and see a lot of problems further downstream. Here's one example of what on the larger image, historically, and we had a mixture of forested watersheds with ephemeral ponds, beaver wetlands, sedge meadows that really, when water dropped from the sky in the upper portions, it was retaining that water, pumping it into the ground through infiltration, and slowly releasing it through low energy channels, which you see on the smaller two images. So healthy headwaters are extremely critical, and any actions need to start in the headwaters if you're going to build that resilience and improve water quality. Hydrologic systems are dynamic. With the emergence of LiDAR and other technology, you're really starting to see kind of an artistic take on how fluvial or hydrologic systems move. That's the basic principle. Rivers or riverine systems move across the landscape based on their valley bottom or their particular landscape position. Are naturally those systems will migrate across the valley bottom, and you can see examples of the oxbows, the meander scars, the other features, the ephemeral wetlands that form. These are on larger systems, of course, but the same theme is happening on our smaller streams, and allowing these fluvial or hydrologic processes to take place is one of the simplest, or maybe not simplest, but one of the needed ways to get back that hydrologic function within our landscape. So if you're not addressing the rivers and streams that flow into our lakes and our communities, you're going to still experience a lot of the same, the algal blooms, the sedimentation, and so on. What's happened, though, is as we've developed our communities, and we've, especially the way we've built our roads, we've really disrupted those dynamic fluvial processes. So our streams and rivers are locked into, passing through single crossings through our culverts and bridges, and that disrupts that channel migration process that I was talking about earlier. In the upper right of this image, you can see some of those old oxbows or those meander features that once, and you can just see how much in this particular area, how much that hydrologic system was moving. Which we've also, we've created static and confined systems in many ways. The way we've ditched our communities, you just don't have the natural water level fluctuations that's critical for the health of wetlands, and also the way our groundwater and streams and rivers behave. We've also, in many ways, this is more common in the southern part of the state, but this is an example from up in the Lake Superior Basin, where we've channelized our systems directly. This was as we sought to create more space for agricultural forestry and our communities. We channelized a system so there's more of that productive land per se. Well, what happens with that, though, as in a channelized systems, you're creating a fire hose effect. So when storms hit and waters get down to the larger portions of our rivers, it's a racetrack down into the lake, and with that extra velocity, and that disconnection that happens, in those runoff events, you'll carry an exorbitant amount of sediment, debris, and other pollutants along with it. Agricultural drains have the same effect. You can see in this example from the village of Plover and the central sands, in a common agricultural landscape. But when storms hit, the waters rush off the field, facilitating soil loss and also picking up phosphorus and nitrogen and other contaminants. That once that water gets into the ditches, it again is that fire hose effect and creating flashier events. A new concept, a way of, especially in steeper landscapes, but the same concepts apply in the flatter areas of our watersheds, is that the way we've developed our communities, headwater areas, because they're smaller wetlands, you have more seasonal ephemeral ponds and other areas that are easily manipulated. Historically, a lot of those headwaters were one of the first places to be displaced, and so. But also, as we've cleared forests for ag and for development purposes, that's confined flows and led to gulling, especially in some cases unintentionally at the outlet of wetland complexes. incision, which is basically like the medical term is that when you go for surgery and you slice and make that incision for your surgery, the same thing happens on the landscape when you have too much runoff. It creates a downcutting effect and further disconnects headwater, wetlands, and other features in that riparian corridor. So many areas, in headwater areas especially, those incised reaches are actually creating a drainage ditch-like effect and lowering the water table, disconnecting those headwater wetlands. And so really, the point is that when those natural erosion and depositional processes become hazardous, it really limits the performance of our existing wetlands. So there may be opportunities out there to target these conditions and put existing wetlands and floodplains back to work. Another example of floodplain disconnection further on the more of the main stem. This is on the west fork of the Kickapoo, and you can see the deposition and the incision processes that are happening. So deposition, when you fuel an accelerated erosion and sedimentation from the headwater areas, all that sediment and debris needs to go somewhere. And what happens is that deposits onto the floodplain and creates an entrenched channel. So you have the deposition that's raising up and confining flows. And when you confine flows, it creates that downcutting process. And so you have a feedback loop where the river is trying to correct itself and move back to equilibrium or healthy conditions. But these deposition and incision effects create further disconnect and exacerbate that fire hose effect. So these floodplains on that valley bottom are unable to intercept and store waters during storms. And because in our large rainoff events, that's often a huge stressor for water quality, not having those floodplains in play can worsen and contribute to water quality issues. It's really, though, all about the energy. When these conversations begin at the community level, there's often, storage is certainly one component. We need to recreate storage, but there's other factors that influence, and it's the best way to sum it up is energy. So the combination of what's going on with storage, infiltration, connectivity, and so on. But on the upper right, and this is an example from a western landscape, so ignore the reference to sagebrush on the lower right. But the upper right shows an example of what a connected floodplain system is. You have a pretty nice, healthy, stable channel that's easily able, when flood flows hit, it's able to exceed its banks and roam into the floodplain. You'll have multiple side channels. You have a deep accumulation of sediment and other material, but really you have an elevated water table. And so within that floodplain, you'll have a mixture of sedge meadows, forested islands, interacting with those different side channels. So really, historically, a single thread stream system is actually not very natural. Our systems are, in a natural occurrence, are meant to have that multi-thread channel development that's working within the floodplain. What happens, though, when you get the disconnected floodplain system from those accelerated erosion and sedimentation processes, you start to see that the riparian corridor starts to convert to drier, woody vegetation, so shrubs and trees. The water table lowers, and you start to get more intermittent or ephemeral stream flow. So you get that canyonate effect. Yep.
Excuse me for interrupting. I'm trying to get Steve Hansen's attention. Steve Hogseth is wanting to be on, and I haven't been able to connect with you via chat. So, excuse me, Kyle.
Oh, no problem.
I don't see him in the participant queue.
Okay, I'll talk with him on the phone. Sorry, Kyle. I'll get out of your. Sorry for interrupting you.
So really, the images show with the Wisconsin-specific examples on the left of what a connected and a disconnected floodplain system look like. So again, it's affecting that water movement and really the volume and velocity of water that's moving downstream, both during small and large storm events. So a little more focus on nitrates, and I want to call out, the science is definitely emerging with specific to water quality. A lot of times the focus is very squarely on phosphorus, but there's a lot of research that's coming out with nitrates too. And this study out of that the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory did out of the University of Minnesota, they did a series of different modeling that looked at the effects of different land management practices. And what they found is that when you have healthy connected wetland complexes, you can, in certain situations, they perform 5 times better than other land management practices, such as cover crops, grazing, no-till, other on-farm practices. So it's really demonstrating the need that if you can figure out ways to incorporate wetlands into working farms, not retiring farmland, but figuring out ways that wetlands can mix in, that you're going to see likely receive a lot of benefits. Ignore that there's a lot in here. These are some loaded figures, but the most important point is that in this modeling, in the upper left, it shows that a disconnected wetland system, so cropland, where you have very heavy ditching, and wetlands that are disconnected because of that drainage and those accelerated erosion. What happens in the most extreme scenario in the upper left, you have a higher concentration of nitrates in those watersheds. When you move to the lower right, and you can see in that yellow image on figure number E, it illustrates the connections and how those wetlands are connected throughout that system. And what they found is in that scenario, you have much less nitrates entering the system during normal low and high flow conditions. But there's other research coming out that's really comparing the infiltration rates in soils in different ag systems. And this is a study that's really focused on ag, those land management practices that are referred to earlier. And as you see, as you move to the right, you can start to see, you get that buildup of organic matter, you get higher infiltration, you get the deep-rooted vegetation that stabilizes the soils and prevents soil loss and activates those water quality processes that happen naturally. But if you were to insert on the right of this a wetland, an image, you would see a much more enhanced effect. That wetlands in many ways are performing these same functions and processes to a greater effect because they are what naturally existed in many of our watersheds. But on the flip side of that, though, farmers, most that we talk to, they recognize that wetlands are performing water quality benefits. There is a legacy of land conversion. But for years, they've recognized that the existing wetlands are performing water quality functions, and they've relied on that. But just like our built infrastructure, how our road systems, our other infrastructure is starting to age and deteriorate, our natural infrastructure is in the same condition. So you have on the left an example, a restored wetland, and you can see the duckweed and the invasive species that are forming in the system because of the just extreme amount of nutrient inputs that's receiving. On the right, you can see a really extreme example of dense Phragmites occurring in a restored wetlands. These are all wetlands that have been restored through farm bill programs and county land conservation. And so looking at areas that we've restored and also existing wetlands that have been overwhelmed by years of managing the nutrients and sediments, their easy targets are looking at those existing wetlands, erasing maybe the effects of ditching that remains in those systems. Many of our wildlife areas, as one example, they still have ditches that run right through them. Those ditches still lower the water table and accelerate the movement of water and nutrients out of those systems. So can we look at our existing infrastructure and figure out ways to make them perform better? So really quickly, I know I'm a little short on time, moving up against the half-hour point, but so figuring out there's voluntary measures certainly of edge of field practices, giving farmers the tools to manage water, making sure there's spillways and other water control structures to naturally mimic the drawdown effects that you might have in wetlands. Also looking at ways grazing and haying actually can be very beneficial to wetlands if done correctly. Low intensity, having rotational grazing can actually stimulate native plant growth and allow the hydrologic processes to form in existing wetlands. So working with farmers to find areas where they don't have to take land out of production and to heal those wetland functions can be extremely important. There's also low-tech approaches up in especially the Lake Superior Basin where we're doing some work. It's how can you develop low-tech approaches that can be easily implemented by landowners. In the 1930s, when the driftless region was unraveling to the the extensive soil loss, they recommended what they referred to as soil saving dams. And one example on the left is a brush dam, and it's basically mimicking a beaver dam. So in those flat areas where you have gullies and ravines, how can you create temporary storage and utilize multiple structures that can work in aggregate together? So if we're unable to find ways to coexist with beavers, we need to replicate their functions on the landscape at a massive scale. So the other option, besides, I emphasize a lot of the voluntary approaches that can be done. And I really am, if a community is going to consider more of a regulatory approach to pair it with those other voluntary measures, it's going to create more of an appetite and hopefully an easier pathway to embracing the different options. But if you're looking to protect more of the baseline and develop more locally led protections, we do have a model ordinance. This was developed about 4 to 5 years ago. The co-author was actually with one of my professors back in the day, Brian Ohm. He specializes in planning law. He has a number of great resources that are directed to counties that lay out options for how to utilize different land use controls. The model ordinance really was developed to be either a standalone ordinance or to provide policy options that can be inserted into your existing ordinances, whether that's zoning and providing decision-making processes or standards that can help when reviewing conditional uses, variances, and rezoning, and land division, whether that can help with establishing standards for plats or certified survey maps. Within stormwater ordinances, what are different requirements that you want to see within those management plans, different BMPs, really encouraging a treatment train approach. And some communities have unified development ordinances, and there may be options within for that particular context. Really, it was developed to hopefully be flexible and customized for each local situation. Really, the goal, though, I emphasize a lot of the hydrology in the first part of my presentation, but it's really providing better ways to manage wetland hydrology through land use regulations and creating healthy, safe, and livable communities. So, some of the easy targets is simply acknowledging wetlands and creating goals within the purpose statement. Is when Plan Commission's Board of Adjustments, when they review those conditional uses and rezonings, the fundamental need is always to look back to the purpose statement. If you have wetlands integrated into the purpose statement, and elevates and creates justification for carefully reviewing potential direct and indirect wetland impacts. Expanding site plan and review standards, also defining land suitability and buildable area standards, and creating protective areas which mimic NR 151 or structural setbacks, which are more common in NR 115, so shoreline or general zoning. So a couple examples, this talk could be its own, but ordinances can be a fairly dry and boring topic. But I'm happy to, if you have any particular questions about the model of what it does or can do, please let me know. But really, the core piece of it is helping to provide recommendations that may improve the site plan preparation and review process. So making sure that wetlands are identified by field conditions and not solely by the Wisconsin Wetland Inventory. On the left, you'll see some examples up top of the Wisconsin Wetland Inventory in yellow. But when you add in the best available information, such as the potential wetlands layer, the other soils mapping information, you'll start to see that wetlands are commonly under-mapped in our communities. So if you have protections that are hitched exclusively to the Wisconsin Wetland Inventory, you're going to miss out on a lot of protections for certain areas. And it's also looking at the contributing drainage area of our systems, using the topography, looking at what is the surrounding effects and how is that wetland being impacted. Both commonly, our federal and state rules are designed to protect activities or discourage activities immediately within the wetland boundary. But because wetlands are receiving water from the upland areas and interacting with our floodplains, they can be indirectly impacted by what's happening upslope and in those adjoining areas. So making sure that in the site plan process, you're identifying seeps and ravines and gullies, which may be influencing the flow and quality of water in those systems. Those can all help with establishing a buildable area, providing the homeowner a space where they can safely develop and avoid those areas to avoid any potential concerns down the road from groundwater flooding, surface water flooding, and so on. And there's also some things in there where that provide some options that may help with utilizing a watershed approach in that land use decision-making process. It's also, dating back to when Ian McHarg, when he first released the Design with Nature, it's the same concepts. How do you incorporate and make wetlands an amenity of our developments rather than and working against? So, making sure there's options to review, preserve, and improve those drainage patterns, allowing opportunity to preserve the vegetative cover or maybe recover some of that. And really, again, looking at those associated hydrologic features as they're referred to in the model ordinance. So making sure that site plan review process is really identifying springs and seeps and other features. So really encouraging low impact development and taking a treatment train approach to figuring out ways to connect naturally occurring wetlands with other green infrastructure features that may be a part of the development. Protective areas or setbacks. There's a lot of examples out there in Wisconsin. Most communities just simply use a structural setback. So there's no vegetative management standards required to that unless it's implemented through a stormwater management approach. So it's intended to align with NR 150 standards. Setbacks, though, the main reason or benefit I've heard from a lot of counties is it provides a margin of error due to some of those wetland mapping issues. So if you have a setback, it won't give the landowner the impression that they can encroach on that wetland boundary that's mapped. It allows them, it provides some red flags it really emphasizes the need to investigate to make sure that you're outside of that wetland boundary area. In the model ordinance, you'll find a bunch of the science behind it and potential distances and widths to consider. There's all like the Southeast Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission. They've also developed a pretty slick little guide that lays out the science and other considerations to look at as well. All right, to wrap up, so a lot of the tools and resources that I talked about, they're all on our website. If I realize I forgot to insert the main link into it, but if you go to our website, there's a tools or a for communities tab up top, and you'll see a lot of the links and other resources that I talked about. We also have a landowner outreach program. Our My Healthy Wetland Handbook is the key piece of that. And really, you know, our services and how we engage in communities can really vary. But on the left, you'll see the companion piece to the model ordinance, which can be, it's really designed to be targeted to local officials, those serving on plan commissions, and anyone who is in charge of land use decision making. So with that, I thank you. I wanted to pull up a quote that our executive director gave to the Speaker's Water Quality Task Force back in August. But really, you know, we'll never fix Wisconsin's water quality problems unless we get a handle on our water movement. So there's looking at floodplains, the condition of our floodplains and wetlands, and really how, to what degree are they connected, and how and where is there opportunity to revitalize those functions on the landscape. So that can be done through voluntary measures and even through a development context. So again, thank you for the time, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to take those.
Great, thank you so much, Kyle. Does anyone have questions for Kyle?
I do.
Okay.
Kyle, where are you located, and what's the nearest organization to Menominee?
Well, we're a small office. We're based in Madison, but we really emphasize getting out across the state. So one of my biggest projects is up in the Ashland area. So I'm frequently going up there, though it's a little uncertain with all the travel and meeting restrictions right now. We have other examples in the village of Clover, Southeast. So if there's interest in meeting, if that's what you're getting at, we can certainly set something up.
Kyle, I was really interested in what you said about the nitrates, or that was in your presentation about with the wetlands can be 5 times better at reducing nitrate. Do you have any hands-on like locations that you guys have researched and come up with something where you came up with the scientific facts like that? Is what I'm asking. Into farmland?
In Wisconsin, we're truthfully, we're a little behind what's going on in surrounding areas. So that research was done in the Minnesota River Valley.
Okay. Okay.
But there are examples in what, actually, before I gave the Wisconsin examples, the other popular place where a lot of the nitrate research is happening is in Iowa, through their Iowa watershed approach and the Iowa Flood Center.
Okay.
So they're working very intentionally with farmers to come up with different techniques. So like 2-stage ditches, saturated buffers, other practices that help to mimic those natural processes and still allow the farmer to drain the field during certain times and make sure it's productive for them. The strongest example that I can give you in Wisconsin is actually up in the northeast part of the state. Outagamie County and Brown County have been doing similar work to the 2-stage ditches, so more engineered systems that are intercepting tile water and providing wetland hydrology and habitat. So that work has been going on for the last 2 to 3 years, and I know they've picked up some momentum. So Jeremy Freund with Outagamie County would be a good person to maybe connect with. The Nature Conservancy has also been supporting that work as well. Our work specifically on nitrates, we don't have a explicit project per se. We're working like in the village of Clover with the Wisconsin Potato and Vegetable Growers Association. The driver there is mostly on groundwater.
Okay. Okay. Great, thanks.
Kyle, is it possible to get a copy of your PowerPoint?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if you would send that to me, then I could share that with everybody.
Yeah, I'll send it to you first thing after this.
Okay, thanks, Kyle.
Okay, great. Okay, any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, Cheryl, this is Kathy. If I could slip in one more.
Sure, sure.
Kyle, there was a discussion by the board about wetlands, and one of the farmers on there was asking, do we have to buffer our buffers? Because I thought wetlands were buffers. And, you know, and how do you respond to that question?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. Part of what I think that comment is coming at is the, you know, farmers have had the impression, though, that, you know, by keeping our wetlands on the landscape, you know, that they really provide that buffering effect. So they were kind of that one of the first lines of defense, you know, at edge of field. When you start talking, you know, there is a push and there is a scientific basis for establishing wetland buffers. And that can certainly help to optimize or increase the functionality of those wetland systems. And some of the guides that I recommended will give you the backdrop to that. But there, I would say, you know, Minnesota and even Wisconsin has a history with pushing forward with riparian buffers, or, you know, whatever the buffer is called. And those generally are not received well by farmers from what I've, you know, if you have a uniform one size fit all buffer standard, you know, buffers, the most important, and that's why I actually in my slide on buffers recommended that any buffer widths be site specific, because if you apply, say, a 75-foot buffer to that entire wetland, one, it's going to take away a lot of farmland, but it's not necessarily going to give you the effect you want. You're going to want to have a larger buffer along the drainage way, or where those different flow paths into the wetland. So you'd want to customize the buffer to that specific situation. That's difficult, though, from an administration perspective, because you have to go case by case in each situation. So what I would suggest with the farmer, there is truth to that there is a buffer fatigue, and it's not going to be received well, but it would be figuring out ways, you know, in that situation, could you work with a farmer if, you know, could they convert certain areas to more perennial grassland? Could they utilize grazing or haying to better manage that wetland? So it's hard without, you know, seeing the site. It's difficult, but I would, the way I would try to respond is to emphasize the need for flexibility, and matching the right practices for that farmer that can help restore the hydrologic functions.
Thanks, Kyle.
Okay, great. Anything else? Okay. Well, Kyle, thank you so much for taking time to present to us today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. I will, if there's any follow-up questions, my contact info is on the screen. I will follow up with the presentation. So I'll stop my share and sign off, and have a good rest of the meeting.
Okay. Thank you so much.